On the next page, additional information is given. Reza decides to maintain control accounts as a part of double entry system. Then it is written, on 1 January 2025, the balance of the purchases ledger control account agreed with the total of balances in the purchases ledger of 23,420. Then below this, a summary of transactions for January 2025 is given, and part B is written, prepare the purchases ledger control account for January 2025. You know very well that on the debit side of the purchases ledger control account, all those accounts are written that cause a decrease in the business liability. And on the credit side, all those accounts are written that cause an increase in the business liability. Another important point is that the amounts in the purchases ledger control account come from the purchases daybook, purchases returns daybook, and the cash book. And specifically from the cash book, only the relevant amounts for discount received and cash paid are transferred here. Since 1 January 2025 is the opening date, and on this opening date, the purchases ledger control account and the purchases ledger balances agree. This means that this amount of 23,420 will be written as the opening balance on the credit side of the purchases ledger control account. Is that correct? Then the amount of payments to credit suppliers causes a decrease in the business liability, which is why it is written on the debit side of this control account. Since this amount comes from the cash book, we write bank here and write down its amount. At the time of making payment, discount received occurs. The business liability has decreased. So this is also written on the debit side. So here we write discount received and write down its amount. The situation of a refund from a credit supplier resulting from an overpayment confuses some students. A refund from a credit supplier resulting from an overpayment at least confirms that the business made a payment to its supplier, for which you will debit the supplier's personal account and credit the cash account. The supplier is debited because the business liability has decreased, and since cash being an asset decreases, it is credited. Because the payment was made slightly in excess, this same creditor, the supplier, becomes a temporary debtor of the business. And when they refund the amount, you would definitely debit the cash account and credit the supplier's personal account. And you already know that the purchases ledger control account is primarily updated from the purchases journal, purchases return journal, and the cash book. However, from this journal entry, it is clear that this entry has been recorded in the relevant supplier's personal account in the purchases ledger and in the cash book. Therefore, this refund amount will not be reflected in the purchases ledger control account from the supplier's personal account. Instead, this refund amount will be reflected on the credit side of the purchases ledger control account. So on the credit side, we write bank and write down its amount. Contra with the sales ledger represents a situation where the business customer is also at the same time its supplier, meaning the business has to receive money from Mr. A and also has to pay money to Mr. A. Contra with sales ledger means the business liability has decreased, which is why we write it on the debit side. So let's write contra with sales ledger and write down its amount. Then it is written interest charged by a credit supplier on an overdue account. When the business delays payment to its credit supplier, the payment becomes overdue. Then the supplier charges interest, and along with the original amount, this interest also has to be paid. Due to the overdue amount, the business liability increases, which is why this will be written on the credit side here. So here we write interest charged and write down its amount. Then it is written purchases journal 22,711. This is very simple matter. This is the total of the purchases journal, meaning the credit purchases, which indicates that the business liability has increased. Therefore, this will be written on the credit side. So let's write credit purchases here and write down its amount. Then it is return purchases returns journal. This is also a very simple matter because this is the total of the purchases returns, which indicates that the business liability has decreased. Therefore, this will be written on the debit side. So let's write purchases returns here and write down its amount. I hope you have understood this, and the mark distribution in the mark scheme is something like this.